Sarah Martinez wiped down the espresso machine for the third time that morning, her movements automatic after 6 years of working at Coastal Brew Café. The morning rush had finally died down, leaving only a handful of regulars scattered across the weathered wooden tables. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting warm patterns on the exposed brick walls that made this little corner cafe feel like home to so many people. At 28, Sarah had never imagined she'd still be serving lattes and croissants, but life had a way of taking unexpected turns. What started as a temporary job after college had become her sanctuary, especially after the accident that changed everything. The cafe sat just 2 blocks from the naval base in San Diego, which meant a steady stream of military personnel throughout the day. She'd learned to read the uniforms, the ranks, the way different branches carried themselves differently. Her manager, Tom, emerged from the back office with a stack of inventory sheets. "Sarah, I'm heading to the bank. Think you can handle things alone for an hour?" His question was more courtesy than concern. Sarah had been running the place single-handedly during quiet periods for years. "Of course," she replied, adjusting her apron. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like an old sweater. Being alone in the cafe never bothered her. If anything, she preferred it. Less small talk, less pretending everything was fine, less explaining why a former Army intelligence officer was now making coffee for a living. The bell above the door chimed as Tom left, and Sarah found herself in that peaceful lull that happened between the morning and lunch crowds. Only 3 customers remained: Mrs. Chen at her usual corner table with her crossword puzzle, a young college student typing furiously on her laptop near the window, and a man at table 3 who'd been nursing the same black coffee for the past hour. Table 3 had always been her favorite spot to observe people. It offered the perfect vantage point of both the entrance and the back of the cafe, with easy access to the emergency exit through the kitchen. Old habits from her military training died hard, and even in civilian life, Sarah found herself cataloging exits and analyzing potential threats without conscious thought. The man at table 3 was different from their usual customers. While most naval personnel came in groups, laughing and joking, this one sat alone with an intensity that made the air around him feel charged. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with the kind of weathered tan that came from spending time outdoors in harsh conditions. His dark hair was cut short but not in the standard military style, and his civilian clothes, dark jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, couldn't hide the way he held himself. Sarah had developed an eye for identifying military personnel even when they weren't in uniform. This man had that particular stillness that came from extensive training, the kind where every muscle was relaxed but ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. His eyes constantly swept the room in a pattern she recognized from her own training, and he sat with his back to the wall, just as she would have done. What struck her most was how he seemed to be waiting for something. Or someone. He'd glanced at his watch 3 times in the past 10 minutes, and there was a tension in his jaw that suggested whatever he was waiting for was important. Sarah found herself stealing glances at him while she reorganized the pastry display, wondering what brought a man like that to their quiet little cafe. The lunch crowd would start arriving soon, and the peaceful atmosphere would give way to the controlled chaos of orders and conversations. Sarah cherished these quiet moments, especially on days when the memories threatened to surface. Today marked exactly 3 years since the convoy incident in Afghanistan, and she'd been fighting the familiar tightness in her chest since she woke up. She'd been off duty that day too, riding along on what should have been a routine supply run to a forward operating base. The IED had been perfectly placed, and if not for Sergeant Rodriguez throwing himself on top of her when the second blast hit, she wouldn't have made it home at all. The physical wounds had healed, but the invisible ones still ached on days like this. The cafe had become her refuge from those memories. Here, surrounded by the gentle hum of conversation and the familiar sounds of espresso machines and clinking cups, she could almost forget the sound of explosions and the weight of survivor's guilt. Almost. The man at table 3 shifted in his seat, and Sarah noticed him check his phone for the first time since he'd arrived. Whatever message he received seemed to relax his shoulders slightly, but his eyes remained alert. She'd seen that same expression on fellow intelligence officers when they were running ops, that careful balance between appearing casual and staying completely aware of their surroundings. Mrs. Chen waved her empty cup in the air with a smile. "Sarah, dear,
could I trouble you for another Earl Grey? Of course, Mrs. Chen.
Sarah moved to prepare the tea, grateful for the distraction from her own thoughts and her curious observation of the mysterious customer. Mrs. Chen had been coming to the cafe for 4 years, always ordering the same thing and always bringing a new crossword puzzle book when she finished the last one. As Sarah brought the steaming cup to Mrs. Chen's table, the older woman leaned forward conspiratorially. "That young man over there," she whispered, nodding toward table 3.
"He's been watching the door like he's expecting trouble. Should we be concerned?"
Sarah glanced back at the man and felt a familiar itch between her shoulder blades, the same sensation she'd learned to trust during her years in intelligence.
Something was happening, though she couldn't put her finger on what.
"I'm sure it's nothing to worry about, Mrs. Chen. Probably just waiting for someone who's running late." But, even as she said it, Sarah didn't quite believe her own words. Her training had taught her to trust her instincts, and, right now, every instinct was telling her that this quiet Tuesday afternoon was about to become anything but ordinary. The college student at the window table suddenly packed up her laptop and left, mumbling something about a class she'd forgotten about. That left just Mrs. Chen, the man at table 3, and Sarah in the cafe. The silence felt heavier somehow, charged with an expectation that made Sarah's pulse quicken slightly. She returned to the counter and began preparing for the lunch rush, but her attention remained divided. Part of her wanted to walk over to table 3 and strike up a conversation, to satisfy the curiosity that was eating at her. But another part, the part trained in operational security, warned her to maintain her distance and simply observe. The man's phone buzzed again, and this time when he read the message, his entire posture changed. Gone was the casual coffee shop customer, replaced by someone who looked ready for action. He didn't move quickly or dramatically, but Sarah caught the subtle shift, the way his muscles tensed and his breathing became more controlled. Sarah found herself moving closer to the espresso machine, positioning herself where she could react quickly if needed. She didn't know what she was expecting, but years of training had taught her that preparation was the difference between life and death. Her hand unconsciously moved to where her service weapon would have been, finding only the empty space at her hip that still felt foreign after 3 years of civilian life. The man at table 3 looked directly at her for the first time since he'd arrived, and Sarah felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with having seen him before. It was the look of someone who understood exactly what she was thinking, someone who recognized the same training and instincts in her that she saw in him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the empty cafe, two veterans who could read the signs that civilians would miss entirely. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, not from fear but from the familiar thrill of recognition, the understanding that passed between people who had served in places where split-second decisions meant survival. Then, the man smiled, and it transformed his entire face. Not the polite smile of a customer, but something warmer and more genuine. He raised his coffee cup slightly in her direction, a small gesture of acknowledgement that somehow conveyed respect and understanding. Sarah found herself smiling back before she could stop herself, feeling a connection she hadn't experienced in years. Whatever was about to happen, she had the distinct feeling that this Tuesday afternoon was going to change everything, just as the title had promised. The only question was whether she was ready for whatever came next. The cafe door chimed again, and Sarah's attention shifted to the new arrival. A woman in her 50s entered, scanning the room with the same careful assessment Sarah had noticed in the man at table 3. She wore a business suit that looked expensive but practical, and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. What caught Sarah's attention most was the way the woman's eyes immediately found table 3, and how the man there straightened almost imperceptibly in response. Sarah busied herself with wiping down the counter while keeping both customers in her peripheral vision. The woman ordered a simple coffee, black, no sugar, and took a seat at table 7, directly across the cafe from the man. They didn't acknowledge each other directly, but Sarah could feel the tension between them like electricity in the air. Mrs. Chen seemed oblivious to the undercurrent, humming softly as she worked on her crossword puzzle. The normalcy of her presence felt almost surreal against the backdrop of whatever was unfolding in Sarah's cafe. For a moment, Sarah wondered if she was imagining things, if her old training was making her see patterns that weren't really there. Then, the man at table 3 stood up and walked to the counter. Up close, Sarah could see the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and sand, and a small scar above his left eyebrow that looked like it came from shrapnel. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the kind of authority that came from leading people in dangerous situations.
"Excuse me," he said, his eyes meeting hers directly. "I was wondering if you could help me with something. I'm looking for someone who might understand a particular situation I'm in."
Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The way he spoke, the careful choice of words, the intensity behind his seemingly casual question, it all felt like the beginning of something significant.
"What kind of situation?" He glanced around the cafe, taking in Mrs. Chen's continued focus on her puzzle and the woman at table 7 who was pretending to read a newspaper. When he looked back at Sarah, there was something almost vulnerable in his expression, as if he were taking a calculated risk. "The kind where a person might need to trust someone they've never met before," he said quietly. "The kind where the right words could mean the difference between success and failure." Sarah's training kicked in fully now. This was operational language, the careful dance of communication used when you couldn't speak directly. She found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn into whatever game was being played. "That sounds like a difficult situation," she replied, matching his careful tone. "What makes you think I might understand it?" The man smiled, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the person beneath the operator's mask. "Call it intuition. Sometimes you can recognize someone who's been where you've been, seen what you've seen." Before Sarah could respond, the woman at table 7 stood and approached the counter. Her movement was fluid and purposeful, and Sarah noticed she positioned herself where she could see both the front door and the kitchen entrance. Professional habits, just like Sarah's own. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "I couldn't help but over here. Are you two discussing travel plans? I might be able to help with recommendations." The coded conversation was becoming clearer now. Sarah felt like she was watching a chess match where she understood the rules but not the stakes. The man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Sarah realized that whatever these two people were dealing with, it was serious enough to require elaborate precautions. "We were just talking about finding the right guides for certain types of terrain," the man replied smoothly. His eyes never left the woman's face, and Sarah could feel the weight of their shared history in that look. The woman nodded slowly. "Mountain terrain can be particularly challenging. It requires people with specialized training, people who know how to navigate when the maps aren't accurate anymore." Sarah found herself holding her breath. Mountain terrain. Maps that weren't accurate. The metaphors were becoming clearer, painting a picture of an operation that had gone off course, of people who needed extraction or assistance. Her old instincts were screaming at her to get involved, to offer help to fellow service members who clearly needed it. But she also knew that getting involved in military operations as a civilian could have serious consequences. Whatever these people were dealing with, it was probably classified at levels that could land her in federal prison if she knew too much. The man seemed to sense her internal struggle. He turned back to her with an expression that was both hopeful and resigned, as if he were about to ask for something he had no right to request. "The thing about guides," he said carefully, "is that sometimes you need someone who knows the local area really well. Someone who's been there before and can help you avoid the dangerous spots." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Local area. He was talking about San Diego, about needing someone with local knowledge for whatever operation they were running. And, somehow, they thought she might be that person. "What makes you think I know the local area well?" she asked, though she was pretty sure she already knew the answer. The woman stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because you've been scanning exits since we walked in. Because you positioned yourself where you can see the entire cafe and reach the kitchen in 3 steps. Because you recognized us before we said a word." Sarah felt exposed, as if these strangers could see straight through to the core of who she used to be. She'd worked so hard to build a quiet civilian life, to put the dangerous world of military intelligence behind her. Now it seemed that world had walked into her cafe on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. "I don't know what you think you know about me," Sarah said carefully, "but I'm just someone who serves coffee." The man's expression softened with understanding. "We all have covers," he said quietly.
Jobs that let us blend in, places where we can pretend the other world doesn't exist. But, sometimes that other world needs us, even when we're trying to stay hidden from it. Mrs. Chen looked up from her crossword puzzle, and Sarah realized how their whispered conversation must look to the outside world. Three people huddled around a coffee shop counter, speaking in tones too low for eavesdropping. She forced herself to smile and speak in a normal voice. "Can I get either of you anything else? More coffee? A pastry?" The woman shook her head, but the man nodded toward the display case. "Actually, could I get one of those muffins? The blueberry one?" As Sarah reached for the muffin, the man leaned closer and spoke quietly. "There's a situation developing. American assets are in danger, and we need someone with local knowledge and intelligence training to help coordinate a response. We can't use official channels for reasons I can't explain." Sarah's hand froze over the muffin display. American assets in danger. That could mean anything from captured soldiers to compromised agents to civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But, whatever it was, these people thought the situation was serious enough to risk approaching a complete stranger for help. "Why me?" she whispered back. "Because you're here, because you have the training, and because sometimes the best operations are run by people who aren't officially part of the system," the woman replied softly. Sarah handed over the muffin, her mind racing. Every logical part of her brain was screaming at her to politely decline, to stick to her quiet life and let someone else handle whatever crisis these people were dealing with. But there was another part of her, the part that had joined the military to serve her country, that couldn't ignore the possibility that people might die if she refused to help. "What kind of time frame are we talking about?" she heard herself ask. The man and woman exchanged a look that told Sarah everything she needed to know about the urgency of their situation. When the man spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd run out of options. "Hours, not days. We have a narrow window, and we need to move soon." Sarah felt the familiar adrenaline surge that came with high-stakes operations. For the first time in 3 years, she felt completely awake, every sense heightened and focused. The cafe around her seemed to fade into background noise as her training kicked into full gear. "If I were to hypothetically help with this situation," she said quietly, "what would that involvement look like?" The woman reached into her purse and pulled out what looked like a business card, but when she handed it to Sarah, it was blank except for a phone number written in pencil. It would look like a phone call in the next 2 hours. Nothing more, nothing less. Just a conversation about those travel recommendations we discussed. Sarah took the card, feeling the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. In her pocket, her own phone buzzed with a text reminder about her therapy appointment later that week. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been working so hard to move past her military service, and now it seemed like that service was calling her back. The man finished his coffee and left exact change on the counter, including a generous tip. "Thank you for the hospitality," he said formally. "This is a nice place. Quiet. Safe. The kind of place where people can think clearly about difficult decisions." As he turned to leave, he paused and looked back at Sarah one more time. "For what it's worth, we wouldn't ask if there were any other options. Sometimes good people are the only thing standing between a bad situation and a complete disaster." The woman followed him toward the door, but stopped before leaving. "The number is good for exactly 2 hours," she said quietly. "After that, we'll have to find another way." Then, they were gone, leaving Sarah alone with Mrs. Chen and a blank business card that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The cafe seemed impossibly quiet after their departure, as if their presence had changed the very air pressure in the room. Mrs. Chen looked up from her puzzle with a confused expression. "Those were interesting customers," she said mildly. "Very intense conversation about travel plans." Sarah forced a smile and nodded, slipping the card into her pocket. "Yeah, some people take their vacations very seriously." But, as she watched the two figures disappear down the street through the cafe windows, Sarah knew she was holding something much more serious than vacation advice. She was holding the key to a decision that would either pull her back into the dangerous world she'd left behind or haunt her forever with questions about what might have happened if she'd chosen differently.
The business card seemed to burn against her leg through her pocket, counting down the minutes until she had to choose between the safety of her quiet civilian life and the call to serve one more time. The lunch rush arrived exactly on schedule, bringing with it the familiar chaos of orders and conversations that usually helped quiet Sarah's racing thoughts. Today, however, the steady stream of customers felt like a countdown timer, each order bringing her closer to the moment when she'd have to decide whether to make that phone call. The blank business card seemed to pulse in her pocket as she mechanically prepared sandwiches and frothed milk for lattes. 2 hours. The woman had been very specific about the time frame, and Sarah's military training told her that such precision usually meant lives were at stake. Real lives, real people who might not make it home if the wrong decisions were made in the next few hours. Tom returned from the bank during the height of the rush, immediately jumping in to help with the sudden influx of customers. Sarah was grateful for his presence, though she found it difficult to focus on the mundane tasks of cafe management while her mind kept replaying the coded conversation she'd witnessed. "You seem distracted today," Tom observed as they worked side by side during a brief lull. "Everything okay?" Sarah forced a smile and nodded toward the crowd. "Just thinking about how busy we've gotten. Remember when we were lucky to get 10 customers during lunch?" It was a safe deflection, and Tom bought it without question. He'd never pressed her about her past, accepting her transition from military to civilian life without the probing questions that might have made their working relationship uncomfortable. Now she was grateful for his discretion, because explaining her current dilemma would have been impossible without revealing classified aspects of her background. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself studying each customer with new eyes. The young mother trying to corral 2 toddlers while ordering coffee. The businessman typing urgently on his laptop while his sandwich grew cold. The elderly couple sharing a piece of cake and reading different sections of the newspaper. All of them living their normal lives, completely unaware that somewhere in their city, a situation was developing that might require the kind of intervention Sarah had been trained to provide. The weight of responsibility felt familiar and terrifying at the same time. During her years in military intelligence, she'd made dozens of decisions that affected other people's lives. She'd analyzed threats, coordinated responses, and lived with the consequences of being right or wrong when the stakes were highest. But that was when she was part of a system, when she had backup and official sanction for her actions. This was different. This was 2 strangers approaching her in a coffee shop and asking her to trust them with information that could land her in prison if she was wrong about who they were or what they represented. But it was also 2 people who had recognized something in her that even she sometimes forgot was still there, the willingness to act when others couldn't or wouldn't. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her therapist's office, confirming her appointment for Thursday. The irony struck her again. She'd been working for months with Dr. Patterson to process her guilt over surviving the convoy attack, to find ways to move forward without carrying the weight of wondering if she could have done more to save her team. Now she was facing a situation where doing more might be exactly what was required. Mrs. Chen had long since finished her tea and crossword, waving goodbye with her usual cheerful smile. The college crowd had moved in and out, leaving behind the afternoon regulars who preferred the cafe's quiet atmosphere for reading or working. By 4 o'clock, Sarah realized she had less than 30 minutes before the phone number would expire and whatever opportunity these strangers had offered would disappear forever. Tom was in the back office doing paperwork, giving Sarah the privacy she'd need to make the call if she decided to go through with it. She pulled the card from her pocket and stared at the handwritten number, trying to imagine what voice would answer if she dialed it. The logical part of her brain enumerated all the reasons not to make the call. She'd built a good life here, quiet and safe and free from the constant stress of operational security. She had her therapy sessions helping her process her trauma, a steady job that she genuinely enjoyed, and the kind of peaceful routine that had seemed impossible during her years of active service. Why risk all of that for people she'd never met, for a situation she knew nothing about? But there was another voice in her head, one that sounded like Sergeant Rodriguez in the moments before he'd thrown himself on top of her to shield her from the second blast. The voice that reminded her why she joined the military in the first place, why she'd chosen intelligence work despite its dangers, why she believed that serving something larger than herself was worth the sacrifices required.
Sarah walked to the cafe windows and looked out at the street where the two strangers had disappeared hours earlier. San Diego stretched out beyond the glass, a city she'd come to love for its blend of military purpose and civilian life. Somewhere out there, if these people were telling the truth, Americans were in danger and running out of time.
Her phone showed 4:47 p.m. 13 minutes left to decide.
Sarah thought about her team members who hadn't made it home from Afghanistan.
Rodriguez, who'd died saving her life.
Lieutenant Morrison, who'd been killed in the first blast.
Staff Sergeant Kim, who'd bled out before the medevac could reach them.
They'd all made split-second decisions to put others before themselves, to risk everything for the mission and their teammates.
Would they have wanted her to make this call? Would they have understood if she chose safety over service?
The answer came to her with startling clarity. They would have wanted her to live, to be happy, to find peace after the war. But they also would have understood that sometimes living meant accepting the responsibility that came with having the skills to help when others couldn't. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed the number before she could change her mind. The call was answered on the first ring by the woman from table 7.
"Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure you would." "I'm not sure I should have," Sarah replied honestly. "But I'm listening. Can you meet us somewhere private? What I need to tell you isn't suitable for a phone conversation." Sarah looked around the cafe.
Tom was still in the office, and they had at least an hour before the dinner crowd would arrive.
"Where?"
"There's a parking garage 2 blocks south of your cafe.
3rd level, northwest corner. Can you be there in 10 minutes?
Sarah's training immediately flagged the location as problematic. A parking garage offered too many blind spots and limited exit routes. But it was also public enough that a kidnapping would be difficult to execute without witnesses. And if these people had wanted to hurt her, they'd had plenty of opportunity to do so when the cafe was empty. "I'll be there," she said. "Come alone, and watch for surveillance. If you think you're being followed or if anything feels wrong, abort and go home.
We'll find another way."
The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone with a mixture of adrenaline and doubt.
She was really doing this.
After 3 years of civilian life, she was walking back into the shadows of military operations. She told Tom she needed to run a quick errand and would be back in 30 minutes. He barely looked up from his invoices, trusting her as he always had to manage her own schedule. The normalcy of the interaction felt surreal given what she was about to do. The walk to the parking garage took 8 minutes, giving Sarah time to scan for surveillance and consider escape routes. Old habits kicked in automatically. She varied her pace, used reflective surfaces to check behind her, and took an indirect route that would expose anyone trying to follow her. By the time she reached the garage, she was confident she was clean. The 3rd level was mostly empty, the northwest corner occupied only by a dark sedan with tinted windows. As Sarah approached, the woman from the cafe stepped out of the driver's seat while the man emerged from the passenger side. Both of them looked relieved to see her, which Sarah took as a good sign.
"Thank you for coming," the woman said without preamble. "I know this isn't easy."
"Before we go any further," Sarah interrupted, "I need to know who you are and what authority you have to involve me in whatever this is." The man reached into his jacket slowly, telegraphing his movements to avoid spooking her, and pulled out a military ID.
"Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell, Navy SEALs. Currently assigned to Naval Special Warfare Development Group."
The woman produced a similar ID.
"Agent Catherine Brooks, Defense Intelligence Agency. We're working a joint operation that's gone sideways."
Sarah studied both IDs carefully. They looked genuine, and the details matched what she'd observed about their training and behavior. But, more importantly, their willingness to identify themselves suggested they were either legitimate or operating at a level where such risks were calculated and acceptable. "What kind of operation?" she asked. "The kind where American hostages are being held by people who shouldn't have been able to take them in the first place," Mitchell replied grimly. "And where the official rescue options have been compromised."
Brooks stepped closer, her expression intense. "We have intelligence indicating that 3 American aid workers were taken from a compound outside Tijuana yesterday. The kidnappers are demanding a prisoner exchange, but the people they want released are high-value terrorists who can't be traded. Sarah felt the familiar chill that came with realizing the stakes were higher than she'd imagined. Why bring this to me? Why not go through official channels? Because we have reason to believe there's a leak in the intelligence community, and because the kidnappers are planning to move the hostages across the border into San Diego tonight, Mitchell explained. Once they're in American territory with American hostages, this becomes a domestic terrorism situation with completely different rules of engagement. And, you think I can help how? Brooks pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a map of the San Diego area with several locations marked in red. You know this area better than anyone. We could get cleared for an operation this sensitive. We need someone who can provide real-time intelligence on local conditions, traffic patterns, police response times, and potential safe houses. Sarah stared at the map, recognizing several of the marked locations as places she'd driven past hundreds of times during her civilian life. The kidnappers weren't just planning to bring hostages into American territory, they were planning to bring them into her neighborhood, the place she'd chosen as a refuge from exactly this kind of situation. What's the timeline? She asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. The exchange is supposed to happen at midnight, Mitchell replied. But we think they'll move the hostages earlier to establish position and wait for their demands to be met. Once those hostages cross the border, they disappear into a city of over 1 million people, and our chances of finding them alive drop to almost zero. Sarah looked at both agents, seeing her own reflection in their determined expressions. These were people who'd spent their careers serving their country, just as she had. They were asking for her help not because they wanted to drag her back into danger, but because American lives were at stake and she had skills that could make the difference between success and failure. The weight of decision settled on her shoulders one more time, heavier now that she understood what was really at stake. 3 innocent people who'd gone abroad to help others were counting on decisions made by people they'd never met. And, somehow, her choice in the next few seconds would help determine whether they lived or died. Sarah looked at her watch. 5:23 p.m. Less than 7 hours until midnight, and probably much less than that before the kidnappers made their move. If she was going to help, she needed to decide now. She thought one more time about her quiet cafe life, about the safety and peace she'd built over the past 3 years. Then, she thought about 3 aid workers who were probably terrified and alone, counting on people like her to bring them home. What do you need me to do? She asked. The safe house was a nondescript apartment complex in Chula Vista, the kind of place where people minded their own business and asked no questions about neighbors who came and went at odd hours. Sarah followed Mitchell and Brooks up 3 flights of stairs, her heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and doubt about what she'd gotten herself into. The apartment had been transformed into a makeshift command center. Computers lined one wall, displaying satellite feeds and communication intercepts. Maps covered every available surface, marked with routes, timing estimates, and contingency plans. 2 other operatives looked up as they entered, a young woman with short blonde hair who introduced herself as Communications Specialist Petty Officer Lisa Chen, and a heavily built man named Master Chief Rodriguez who reminded Sarah painfully of her lost teammate. "What's our status?" Brooks asked without preamble. Still no direct visual on the hostages, but Signals Intelligence confirms they're being held in a compound about 2 miles south of the border, Chen reported. The kidnappers made contact again an hour ago, demanding confirmation that the prisoner exchange has been authorized. Mitchell studied a computer screen showing border crossing patterns. They're using the same routes the cartels use for smuggling operations. Multiple crossing points, switching vehicles every few miles, using local knowledge to avoid border patrol checkpoints. Sarah found herself studying the maps with professional interest despite her nervousness. The kidnappers had chosen their routes well, using a combination of official crossing points and known smuggling paths that would make tracking them nearly impossible without advance intelligence. But, as she examined the marked locations, she began to see patterns that outsiders might miss. They're avoiding the Interstate 5 corridor, she observed, pointing to several marked routes. Too much traffic, too many cameras, too many opportunities for random stops. But, this route here, she traced a line along surface streets that paralleled the freeway,
this takes them through neighborhoods with limited police presence and multiple escape routes if something goes wrong.
Rodriguez leaned over her shoulder, studying her analysis. You know this area well.
I've lived here for 3 years, and I spent 2 years before that analyzing traffic patterns and urban terrain for convoy security, Sarah replied. These neighborhoods look random, but there's a logic to how they connect. If I wanted to move people without being noticed, this is exactly the route I'd choose.
Brooks pulled up a different map showing real-time traffic conditions. The problem is we don't know exactly when they'll move or which specific route they'll take.
We have 3 possible crossing points and 5 potential routes once they're on the American side.
That's assuming they stick to the plan, Mitchell added grimly.
If they suspect we're onto them, they could change everything at the last minute. Sarah stared at the maps, her mind working through the tactical puzzle. During her intelligence training, she'd learned that successful operations often came down to predicting human behavior under stress. The kidnappers weren't just trying to move 3 people across a border, they were trying to do it while maintaining operational security and keeping leverage for their demands.
What kind of timeline are they working with? She asked. Chen consulted her communications intercepts.
Latest intelligence suggests they want to have the hostages in position by 10 p.m., then wait for confirmation of the prisoner exchange before proceeding to the actual handover location.
That gives us a window, Sarah realized.
They can't afford to keep moving the hostages around the city for hours, too much exposure, too many chances for someone to notice. They need a safe location where they can wait without drawing attention. She turned back to the maps, this time focusing on the areas near the marked crossing points. If I'm them, I want somewhere with easy access to major roads but far enough from busy areas that neighbors won't hear anything unusual.
Somewhere I can park vehicles without them looking out of place.
Her finger stopped on a cluster of industrial buildings near the Otay Mesa border crossing.
Here. These are mostly warehouses and light manufacturing. Lots of truck traffic during the day, but it gets quiet at night. Multiple road access, close to the border, and the kind of place where 3 extra people in a building wouldn't be noticed. Mitchell studied the area she'd indicated. Commercial district. Good sightlines for surveillance, but also good cover for an approach. What's the police response time?
15 to 20 minutes for this area, Sarah replied without hesitation. There's a substation about 3 miles away, but they don't patrol this sector heavily unless there's a specific complaint.
Rodriguez was already pulling up building schematics on his computer.
7 potential structures that fit the profile. We'd need eyes on all of them to confirm which one they're using. That's a lot of ground to cover with our current team, Brooks observed. Sarah found herself volunteering before she could think better of it.
I could take surveillance on the eastern buildings.
I know the area well enough to move without being noticed, and I have the training to spot operational security measures. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. Sarah realized she'd just crossed a line from consultant to active participant in what was essentially a military operation on American soil. The implications were staggering, but 3 innocent people were depending on decisions made in the next few hours. That would put you at significant personal risk, Mitchell said carefully.
These aren't ordinary criminals. They're well-trained, well-armed, and they've already demonstrated willingness to escalate violence.
Sarah thought about the convoy attack, about the split seconds where everything changed from routine to life or death. She'd lived through that kind of escalation before. More importantly, she'd learned to function effectively when the stakes were highest.
I understand the risks, she said. But you need local knowledge, and I'm the only one here who has it combined with the training to use it effectively. Brooks studied her for a long moment. If we do this, you're not officially part of the operation. If something goes wrong, we can't provide backup or extraction. You'd be completely on your own.
I've been on my own before, Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Chen spoke up from her communications station.
We just intercepted another transmission. The kidnappers are confirming their timeline. They're moving the hostages at 9 p.m., 1 hour earlier than we estimated. Sarah checked her watch. 7:15 p.m.
Less than 2 hours to identify the location, coordinate a response, and execute a rescue operation without getting 3 innocent people killed in the process.
We need to move now, Mitchell decided.
Sarah, if you're willing to do this, we'll set you up with communications gear and basic protective equipment. Your job is observation only, locate the hostages and report back.
Under no circumstances do you attempt direct intervention. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of preparation.
Sarah was fitted with a nearly invisible communications earpiece and a small camera that could transmit real-time video to the command center. Rodriguez gave her a tactical vest that looked like a casual jacket and a small pistol that she hoped she wouldn't need to use. As she prepared to leave, Brooks pulled her aside.
"You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "We can find another way."
Sarah looked around the command center at the maps and equipment, at the dedicated professionals who'd spent their careers protecting people like the kidnapped aid workers. 3 years ago, someone threw himself on a grenade to save my life, she said.
I've been trying to figure out how to live with that gift ever since. Maybe this is how. Brooks nodded with understanding. Stay safe out there. And, remember, observation only. We need you alive to provide intelligence, not dead trying to be a hero.
The industrial district looked different at night, shadows creating blind spots and hiding places that didn't exist during daylight hours. Sarah moved carefully through the area, using her knowledge of the terrain to approach each potential location without exposing herself to observation from the buildings.
The first 3 warehouses showed no signs of unusual activity.
Normal night security lighting, no extra vehicles, no indication that they were being used for anything other than their intended purpose. But, as Sarah approached the 4th location, something felt different. The building itself looked similar to the others, a large rectangular structure with loading docks and minimal windows. But, there were subtle signs that trained eyes could recognize. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel leading to a side entrance.
A cigarette, but that was still warm near the corner of the building.
Most telling of all, a small piece of duct tape over one of the security lights, reducing illumination without completely disabling the fixture.
Sarah activated her communications gear and spoke quietly into the concealed microphone. Possible target identified. Building 7 in the eastern sector.
Signs of recent activity and security modifications. Mitchell's voice came through her earpiece clearly.
Can you get visual confirmation?
Sarah studied the building's layout, looking for an approach that would give her a view inside without exposing her position. A maintenance ladder on the side of the building led to the roof, which would provide the elevation she needed to see through the high windows.
Working on it, she whispered back.
The climb was more difficult than she'd expected, her civilian life having cost her some of the physical conditioning she'd maintained during active duty. But, adrenaline and training carried her to the roof without incident, where she found a skylight that provided a perfect view of the interior. What she saw below made her stomach clench with anger and determination. 3 people sat tied to chairs in the center of the empty warehouse space, 2 women and 1 man, all appearing to be in their 20s or early 30s. Even from her elevated position, Sarah could see they'd been roughed up but appeared alert and relatively unharmed. 5 armed men moved around the warehouse, checking weapons and discussing something in Spanish too quiet for Sarah to hear clearly. But their body language suggested tension and preparation for imminent action.
Confirmed, Sarah whispered into her microphone. 3 hostages, 5 hostiles, warehouse interior. They're armed and preparing to move. Can you maintain observation? Mitchell asked.
Sarah was about to confirm when she heard the sound of vehicles approaching the building. Through the skylight, she watched the armed men respond immediately, moving to positions near the entrances and checking their weapons one final time. Multiple vehicles approaching, she reported.
Looks like they're ahead of schedule.
The warehouse doors opened, and 3 more armed men entered, speaking rapidly in Spanish with obvious urgency. Sarah caught enough of their conversation to understand that something had changed in their plans, that they were moving the operation forward due to unspecified concerns about law enforcement activity.
They're spooked, Sarah whispered. They're moving now, not waiting until 10. Can you see the vehicles? types, license plates, anything that would help us track them? Sarah shifted position to get a better view of the parking area. 2 dark SUVs and a panel van, all with Mexican license plates that were probably stolen or fake. But, as she watched, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the kidnappers was setting up what looked like an explosive device near the chairs where the hostages were sitting. Not enough to bring down the building, but more than enough to kill 3 innocent people if the rescue went wrong. "Mitchell, they're rigging explosives," she reported urgently. "If we hit them hard, they'll kill the hostages." The silence on the radio stretched for several seconds before Mitchell responded. "Stay in position. We're adapting the plan." Sarah watched as the kidnappers began preparing to move the hostages, cutting their restraints but keeping guns trained on them at all times. The explosive device remained in place, connected to what looked like a dead man's switch carried by one of the leaders. She realized with growing horror that a conventional rescue operation would likely result in the deaths of the people they were trying to save. The kidnappers had prepared for the possibility of law enforcement intervention, and they were willing to kill their hostages rather than lose them. But, as Sarah studied the layout of the warehouse and the positioning of the guards, she began to see possibilities that a team approaching from ground level would miss. From her elevated position, she could see blind spots and angles of approach that might allow for a different kind of intervention. "Mitchell," she whispered, "I think there's another option. But it would require someone already in position to neutralize the explosive device before your team moves in." The silence on the radio was longer this time. When Mitchell finally responded, his voice was tight with concern. "Sarah, your orders are observation only. Do not attempt direct intervention." But, as she watched the kidnappers force the 3 aid workers toward the vehicles, Sarah knew that following orders might mean watching innocent people die. She thought about Sergeant Rodriguez, about the split-second decision that had saved her life, about the responsibility that came with having the skills and position to act when others couldn't. The hostages were being loaded into the panel van now, their faces pale with fear but determined not to give up hope. Sarah made her own split-second decision, the kind that defined who someone really was when everything was on the line. "I'm sorry, Mitchell," she whispered into the microphone. "But sometimes the mission requires improvisation." Then, she turned off her communications gear and began planning how to get 3 innocent people home alive, even if it meant risking everything she'd built since leaving the military behind. The cafe would have to wait. Right now, being off duty was a luxury she couldn't afford. The operation was about to become very personal, and Sarah Martinez was ready to remember exactly who she'd been trained to be.